Okay, so I think you've got to look back across rescues and ask yourself, not what are the new ones, but where are we with some of the large ones. So you've got the ongoing drama at SAA, which comes back to the same problems you'd have if you had a very small or medium-sized rescue, which is there is no PCF. There's incredibly slow decision-making across the value chain. And if you add in what's happened with the other competitors, you've had the regulators stepping in to stop the business rescue processes by revoking operational licenses. So you've seen companies that had a reasonable prospect having their licenses revoked and then collapsing into liquidation. And that's just in that industry. When you move into the private sector, I suppose the biggest story of the year was what happened at Tongaat. Tongaat tried a very strong workout, and when they failed to raise the capital they needed, it went into a rescue. They haven't yet come up with a plan on how to solve it because I don't think they can. There's so much debt in Tongaat with such deep-seated fraud and corruption and misstated financial statements that unless someone's prepared to write off a fair chunk of change, restructuring Tongaat is going to be a multi-year proposal. You have the same role players in both processes. So this is a case when workout fails, then go to rescue. But it's not sure who is calling up the debt. And the thing that does change when you move from a workout into a rescue, of course, is that your shareholders are excluded from the process. And the process is now run by an independent rescue practitioner, his team, and the principal creditors, mostly the security holders. So what you've had here is simply something that's moved away from the shareholders being asked to fund the gap, to the debt providers being asked to restructure their debt, having decided that there is no equity left in the business. So big role players like the PIC are sitting high and dry because they weren't necessarily exposed to the debt, but they are the principal shareholders. Only the banks will win when the assets are stripped in the forced sales. I mean, that's quite clear. This is a rearrangement of the assets, and it will result in improving the security to the lenders. Whether that is the Zimbabwean shareholders or whether that is the local banks, and only time will tell. And of course, it did also show us that auditors and directors are facing increasing consequences. Interesting that it's the executive directors and not the oversight directors who are taking the pain in this particular case. One has to ask, where was the audit committee when you are presented a set of financial statements with assets that don't exist and are horribly overvalued? What reasonable care was taken by the audit committee and those directors? Because if you're going to have independent oversight of large groups, then the accountability has to sit with the independent directors as well as the operational ones. Fair enough, the operational directors perpetrated the frauds, and maybe the independent directors didn't have all the information they needed to exercise their responsibilities with the kind of care and diligence one might have expected. There are still questions to ask around Tongaat. So creative, the thing I would say around Tongaat and SA, be creative when seeking solutions. In restructuring large assets, maybe you need to able to compel debt for equity swaps to get the provisions for hostile take-up in BR sorted. That has been the sort of Texas Hold'em auction approach that you've had for years in the Act, which when it's been attempted failed, should be available in Tongaat, and that might well see the Zimbabweans playing a bigger role in the assets going forward. But those provisions are fatally flawed according to some of the court decisions we had in the past. The DTI needs to sort this out to make our capital markets more efficient. Yesterday, when they came out with the Company Laws Amendment Act a few years ago, they hadn't addressed this issue. So it remains a bottleneck. Well, if you look at the cascade of turnaround and you ask yourself, there's an internal workout by the management team and its board, which is the normal run-of-the-mill business, right? These businesses are working well, these businesses aren't. There are supply chain issues here and they're knocking other businesses. Those matters can be dealt with operationally and at a board level in most companies all the time. Given our economic environment right now, there are few companies that are not distressed. Maybe the solar providers are doing quite well, but they will have supply chain issues, they will have backlog issues. They will fund households for solar that they shouldn't. So while they're in a boom industry, there will be a time will come when they'll have to work out the excesses of the current boom. That's true in any industry. Workout, then you move to a managed workout and maybe you appoint a chief restructuring officer. That really works when you've got toxic assets, and perhaps the best and most successful case of that, and kudos to the people who were in charge of it, was African Bank. African Bank took its good assets and kept the bank alive. That was pretty much a rescue, although not in terms of the Companies Act. And it took its toxic assets and bailed them into a separate entity, and they've done a workout on the toxic assets. And the returns to shareholders from that combination and approach to the restructure of African Bank has resulted in the bank remaining viable, still providing loans to a market that desperately needs them, and they've recovered a good portion of the capital that was invested. So that's a good workout story, done in terms of the Banks Act and other things. And banks do know how to manage workouts within their own departments. If you look at what needs to happen, then you have to decide whether you're going to have a workout or are you going to in fact have a distressed sale or recapitalization that saves some jobs. And boards are supposed to clearly set this out in the way they believe the company can be saved, and I think they seldom do. Perhaps the biggest problem with rescues is not that apparent. Because it removes power from shareholders and gives it to debt holders, you create an environment for lawfare where the shareholders are now trying to keep control of the assets and the creditors want a return of their capital. So shareholders don't have any vote in the process, they can only litigate. And they litigate to remove the business rescue practitioners, they litigate against each other. And the problem with companies in business rescue is they don't have money for litigation. So when you start litigating, that almost inevitably collapses into liquidation, which is counterintuitive, but buys the stakeholders and those directors who may have done something wrong more time to correct their actions or protect their assets. We've certainly seen it in the kind of litigation you've seen around Optimum, the kinds of threat litigations you see in SAA, the litigation that you no doubt see in Tongaat going on. Of course, the massive litigation in Steinhoff, although that went into a managed workout rather than a rescue or liquidation, there will be liquidations in that group as they unravel it. Very unlikely that there'll be any structured business rescue process in that process. So if you aren't going to litigate each other as directors and shareholders, you believe your business can be saved, or you need a managed sale process that preserves most of your investment, then rescue certainly will work better than a liquidation, because a liquidation stops your business. Liquidators will tell you, well, you can do everything in a rescue that you can do in a rescue, you can do in liquidation, except you stop the business. You've terminated the employee's rights. So maybe in a provisional liquidation you can get away with it, but the truth of the matter is, whether it's a provisional liquidation or rescue, it's the quality of the rescue practitioner and the cooperation of the creditors that will see the desired outcome being achieved. And in that case, the business rescue provisions offer a better framework for the workout than a provisional liquidation does. if you look at both the European regulations and the US, you had a COVID boom, you had a supply chain bust, you had a Brexit exit, and you haven't yet seen all of the big liquidation fallouts from those big moves as people try and reposition their assets. They've also had a lot of liquidity in those markets, and as that liquidity recedes because of the higher interest rates and inflation expectations, that's going to run through those economies in a recession. But both the Europeans and the Americans have very different regimes to us in terms of how they manage workouts. So the US does take a very harsh look at a business if it doesn't work. They liquidate it. So I suppose the biggest shock was cryptocurrencies. Where you had a wholesaler buying and selling crypto coins, but in fact not retaining enough in its reserve. So, literally taking Peter's money, giving it to a hedge fund, and losing it. There's no system in the world where you've got fraud of that nature that doesn't want a liquidation rather than a managed workout. Because in a liquidation, you can find out where the money has gone, who's got it, and who's going to jail. That needs to happen here too. But as we've seen, who goes to jail? Maybe the men from Dongrot will be the first. But, if you look at the kind of mistakes you've seen at Eskom, at Transnet, any number of private sector companies, you don't see any of those guys marching anywhere close to jail anytime soon. And without the consequence management of delinquency being properly put through, you're not going to see that kind of recovery. So if this is going to work for us, then we need to take someone like Adudu Mayeni into a civil court and make her pay back all her money. And if that bankrupts her and forces her into insolvency, so be it. Her decisions created massive losses for us as taxpayers, and even more losses in terms of our industrial capacity in our airlines industry. Sure, she's not the only person responsible for it. There were many others involved, but you have to start with the chairman of the board. I think the cryptocurrency blast is going to be really long term. It was sort of seen as the new reserve currency and a new way of trading. I think people have woken up to the realization that it is even more risky than using the rand to do trade between two partners. We will see the regulation of cryptocurrencies in the US and Europe and the UK and also China, and that will cause more shakeouts in that market. And then, of course, as the supply chain unwinds, we've seen Boeing's results, with the kind of funding that they had available to them, they've managed the worst of it. Perhaps a century ago, a lot more companies have gone into liquidation. We saw the Chinese narrowly avoid a major investment crisis in the commercial and residential property market, but once more that was backed by paper money. So at some point, the thing about debt is no matter how you focus it, at some point you have to repay it. So we'll see what happens then. Well, global trade is has waves. Those waves land on your shore whether you want them there or not. So everything that happens in a global market affects you here locally. Take the crypto example. A lot of the local crypto traders lost their shirts. So yes, certainly, you will see that. There's no doubt that as these large international businesses sort out their global supply chains, we're going to be faced with a real challenge in South Africa. And that's simply going to come back down to the allocation of capital. Why would you invest in Africa? Why would you invest in South Africa? And what sectors will invest in South Africa? Mines and mining, there are challenges there with the regulator. Infrastructure, we don't have any construction companies of any particular size left. The Eskom rebuild, again, there's no money. So, if you look at when those opportunities arrive here and when those waves arrive here, they're going to find a fairly battled and embattled economy. And consequently, I would suspect that many of them are going to simply close up shop and leave. I mean, KFC's been here for a very long time, but closing stores for 4 or 5 hours a day because you don't have electricity and now you can't get chickens. Marginal stores will close. And that's not just a South African problem, that's becoming a global problem. As young brands battle across the US, once they enter into a retrenchment process and pull their businesses back, that flows through the whole global business. So yes, very definitely the stuff that happens in Europe, China and the US as our largest trading partners, and Germany, will have a very serious effect on us. Well, I think that's a business question rather than a turnaround professional. So I think that you have to be selective about your core problems and find out as a business owner what you can fix, what needs to be fixed, and where you're going to get the best one. And look for people who are turnaround experts in those particular segments. So if you have a supply chain problem, and that's your problem, is get people in to help you sort out your supply chain. And that can be anything from, and by now across COVID we've had a lot of that. So if you're a retailer and you haven't got an e-retail strategy, you should have done that 2 years ago. You're now going to simply take pain. If you are a large retailer with store base that's collapsing, you're going to have to rebase your business. You're going to have to take lower rentals, and you're going to have to lower your operating costs. That's going to be a real challenge because in shopping centres, one of the biggest operating costs is rates and taxes, and power and utilities. None of those things look like retracing the cost base anytime soon. So that sector is going to take a lot of pain. And there's very little that a turnaround professional can tell these large managed groups with large capital bases, with large utilities that they understand. But if you're a small property owner, maybe you've got a shopping centre in a small regional town, have a look at your product, your consumers. Have a look at your product mix. Maybe you need to go to a much lower cost model. If you start looking at how Pick n Pay is dealing with some of its problems, it's quite interesting. They're converting many of their stores, which 3 or 4 years ago were a flagship store, into much reduced line item offerings, or they're converting them to boxes to stores. So they move their brand and they reposition their product offering. So there's a lot you can do, but I don't think you can simply say they did this in Europe, it'll work here anymore.